Hello and welcome back. This is Dawn with a video for Picket Fence Studios. So today we're going to be taking a look at gouache and we're going to be pairing it with some new stamp sets from Picket Fence. We're going to be painting two florals today in two different styles using the same medium. So let's get started. To demonstrate these two different styles, I've pulled two very different stamp sets. So Beauty, found in a vase here, has a bunch of small, very detailed flowers in it. And then this Graceful Magnolias has very simple opened illustration. So it's going to be perfect for demonstrating these two different styles. I've pulled out my gouache. And because it's opaque, I am going to take advantage of that, and we're going to be working on Stonehenge Aqua Cold Press watercolor paper in black. This is where gouache really shines, on dark colors. Now, in real life, if I stamp black ink on this black paper, I can just barely see it. However, it's impossible to see on camera. And my eyesight isn't quite what it used to be. So I'm going to stamp in some pumice stone oxide ink here. This is a pigment dye blend, so that pigment ink is going to sit on top and it's going to allow me to see my stamped lines very clearly, and it's going to allow you to see the stamping very clearly on camera as well. That just means I have to be a little more vigilant about covering all of those stamp lines when I paint. Now, because these florals are quite small and detailed here in this image, I'm not going to bother with trying to follow accurately all of the lines. I'm going to take a more expressive approach, and I'm going to use the lines as my general guide for where each flower starts and begins. Everything else I'm going to kind of make up. And you could certainly do a more detailed painting where you follow the illustration very closely. And I'll show you an example of the same image done that way, but you can see there, some of those are just a mess of lines in the middle, and why torture yourself? So we're gonna have a little fun with this one. And just like with every other medium, you can custom mix your colors. So I didn't quite have the green that I was looking for straight out of the tube, so I just taken some yellow, I added a little blue to make it green, and then it was a little bright, so I added a little bit of orange to that green just to kind of neutralize the brightness of it a little bit. And now I'm adding just a tiny bit of white to lighten it up a little. So for this one, I do want to go with the brighter greens, but I don't want a garish green. I'm using a number 2 round brush right now, and I'm using the gouache quite thick. And I'm going to start with all of the pieces or the parts of the arrangement that are in the background. So the wonderful thing about gouache is that it is opaque. So unlike watercolor, where you work light to dark, with gouache you work dark to light or light to dark. It doesn't matter, because each color is going to cover the color underneath it. So you can go back and forth and play until you get exactly what you want. You can layer the colors while they're wet to get more of a blend, or you can wait for them to dry completely and then come back over it. So gouache is really, really versatile in that aspect. You can water it down and use it more like watercolor, or you can use it in a thicker consistency like I'm doing here and use it more like acrylic. The difference being, acrylic, once it's dry on your palette, you can't reconstitute it with water. However, gouache, like watercolor, if it dries on your palette, you can just hit it with a little bit of water to reconstitute it. Now you may notice when I'm painting this, not only am I changing up my color greens, so sometimes I'll add a little bit more blue to make it blue-green, sometimes I'll add a little bit more of a red to that green to desaturate it a little bit. I'm kind of making sure to switch up my color of greens throughout my arrangement, and that's basically because you don't want all one color green. It's going to look boring. And then if you imagine that the light is hitting this arrangement, it's going to be hitting all of those leaves at different angles and different intensities, because this is a 3-dimensional bouquet, right? So those leaves that are in the background are going to receive less light than the ones that are in the foreground. So make sure that you just kind of vary your greens just ever so slightly. It makes a big difference. Now, I am having trouble figuring out what is what in this little mush of lines. So I'm going to use the stamp set over here to the side so that I can kind of guide myself. But really, I'm not too worried about it. You can see I'm painting these leaves in, and in some areas I'm going right over some of the flower lines. That's fine. I am not trying to be super precise and tuck these leaves behind flower petals. I can paint the flowers right on top of these leaves, and they will completely block out the green underneath. So I'm not freaking out over making sure that I don't put paint over the flower petal lines. This does mean that I will lose some of those lines. I won't be able to see what's under them because, again, gouache is opaque. That's fine. I'll make it up. That's the fun part. I will just make up what I can't see. I just know that here I have a very good guide, a very good visualization of there should be a large flower here. There should be a large flower here and a small flower there. So everything in between I can just make up. Now for the flowers, I've switched over to a number 4 filbert brush, and this brush has a rounded tip, whereas a round brush has a very pointy tip, and then a flat brush has a flat blunt tip. This is a rounded tip. This is going to allow me to create the flower petal shapes with the strokes instead of filling inside the lines, if that makes sense. So I can very quickly, just with a few little strokes, create these little flower petal shapes. And I'm not being precise here, you guys. I'm going for the suggestion of flowers. I'm not going for accuracy. So a few little well-placed strokes that are in petal shapes will give the illusion of a flower. And we don't have to worry about what type of flower. It just looks like a flower. So play with your color, play with your placement. Don't overthink it. I am notorious for overthinking it, and watching the footage here, I can see several spots where I'm like, oh, why didn't you just leave that? It was fine. Or I liked it better before. But you know, that's the whole journey of art. You will learn something new when you try something new, and you're gonna go back and forth, right? Sometimes you're gonna like it and sometimes you're not gonna like it, but you'll never know until you actually just try it. So don't be afraid of messing it up or making a mistake. Mistakes are just opportunities to learn. Now, to me personally, a lot of these flowers, all of these flowers really look like some type of either a mum or a dahlia. Dahlias are notoriously big flower family, and there's so many different varieties and petal shapes. So I kind of just went with that as being my inspiration. Very loose again, very loose inspiration. And my color palette, I wanted to keep it autumnal because we are in October here. So I chose this like wine color along with some yellows and some oranges. And I thought that that would be really pretty. So a couple of things to take note as I continue filling in these flowers. One, you'll notice that I turn my paper a lot. That's because for me, it's more comfortable to pull the brush towards me. I feel like I get the best or the most pleasing strokes when I do that. So I'm turning the paper so that my hand is comfortable and I don't have to turn it in awkward positions to make my strokes. I'm also making sure to vary my colors. I did that with my leaves and I'm doing that with my flowers. So I'll do a couple of petals and then I will maybe add a little bit of yellow into my orange mixture to brighten it up a little bit. Make a couple other strokes, maybe add some white and then do some more strokes. So it's a very back and forth process, and I try not to use the same color for too long. That's just going to add life and movement to the actual painting here. Now for these littler, very spindly flower petals here, I've switched over to, I want to say this is the number 0 brush. And again, I'm using the strokes of that the brush makes to create the petals rather than doing it coloring book style where you fill in the open spaces. I am using that brush to create the petals, and this yellow flower here is a perfect example of that. I've switched back to the filbert and I am just using simple one stroke movements here to create those petal shapes. Just like before, mixing in a little bit of white to create some highlights on some of those petals. And then now we're going to move to the other large flower, and I've done that wine color again because we did that in the lower right hand corner. I'm going to balance this by putting a little bit of that wine color here in the upper right. And this is all just kind of a rinse and repeat, varying up my color and my petal direction. Now for this very front flower, I do want to create a bright moment, right? This is kind of dark. I've got a lot of that maroonish, winey color going on and just a couple pops of yellow. So this middle one is kind of going to be the hero of the arrangement. So we're going with a very bright yellow, and it's also the largest flower, so it's really just going to pop here in the middle. Again, a couple of lighter petals, mix in a little more yellow to make some darker petals. and then a little bit of light yellow again to pull in some more. So you can see here, it's so very forgiving. It's so very forgiving. If you've never used gouache before, I highly recommend you give it a try. So these little tiny flowers were going to be our pop of white. And again, a few simple, well-placed strokes, and we've got some daisy-like flowers. All right, the final thing for the base of this painting is to paint in those stems, and no different than we did for the rest of the arrangement, we're going to vary up our greens. Some are going to be darker, some are going to be brighter. And then we can move on to adding some details here. Okay, so we've taken it back to real time here, and you can see I'm about to splash some gouache on my painting. You see that? Yeah, I'm not going to worry about it, you guys. I'll show you a way that we can cover that up here at the end. So don't worry about that. I'm not going to worry about it. I'm going to let it dry. Now it's time to add in our details. So gouache dries flat. Because it's opaque, it does not allow light to pass through it. So unlike watercolor that has that beautiful luminosity because the light can shine through, bounce off the white paper and back through the paint, gouache is opaque. So it dries very flat, and we need to add in those highlights. And to do that, we're going to add some very white highlights. Here I'm working with what would be a very light green, but in a lot of places I am going to put in some straight white, and you'll see that when we get to it. But again, just a few well-placed, lighter, brighter hits of any color that you're painting over. In this case, it's the very, very light pale green is going to give that brightness, that freshness, because I mean, you can see here, especially that maroon color, it looks very flat, very chalky. By adding in these pops of very bright color, it helps to liven up the overall thing. Now you can go overboard, and in some places, admittedly, I did go overboard, but I'm not mad about it. It's a greeting card, you guys. It's not going in the Louvre. So don't be afraid. I can't stress that enough. Don't be afraid to try. Everything that we create is not going to be a masterpiece. But again, it's a card. It's a greeting card in the end. So if it brings you joy to create it, then it has done its job, and giving it to somebody else and it bringing them joy is just a bonus. And maybe that's backwards. I think most people give cards to bring joy to somebody else. For me, the joy is in creating it. I don't care what goes on with it after that, honestly. All right, so I'm going to pretend like I didn't admit that, and we're going to do the vase here, the glass. And glass is clear. It's on black, so we don't have to do much. All we have to do is add kind of the highlights of the light shining on the glass. So I'm using pure white here. And then I'm going to take a damp brush and just kind of scrumble through it to obscure some of the stems there, make them bleed out a little bit, make that white bleed out just a little bit to create like a glare. And that's it. It looks like clear glass now. All right, so now let's go ahead and add just a tiny bit more detail to the centers. This is where I, in my opinion, kind of messed it up. I didn't like my center, so I went right over it. But you can see, I just went right over it with white, over that dark umber. And then I added in a new center, and voila, it's done. Looks great. So let's go ahead and move on to our second style of painting, and then we can review both of these cards at the end. You know what? I lied. Here's what I'm going to do first. I'm going to show you that we have a very expressive painting here, and I felt like it was a little too controlled. The bouquet wasn't quite wild enough. Not wild. Wasn't quite flowy enough. So I decided to hand draw in just a couple more leaves here, and I'm going to build upon this bouquet a little bit. And I actually did it with, that's how I'm going to cover up my little flecks of white there in the corner as well. I will add in some darker blue-green leaves, and they will look like they're recessed into the background. But I just wanted to show you how you can expand upon what you've already done. You can kind of extend it and kind of put your own creative flair on it. Okay, so now we're really going to jump into the next card. So this one is going to be a little bit more controlled, but still have that painterly look to it. Just like before, I've stamped this in that pumice stone oxide ink, and you can see that this image is much more open and it's much more clear to see what I'm painting. And I do want to keep this one truer to the original illustration. So I am going to paint around the stamped lines a bit, but I'm not going to be overly careful. So in some areas, as long as I can tell what the original illustration was underneath, I can go over a little bit. I'm not going to worry too much about, you know, being exact. Like right here, I went over that petal, but that's because I can clearly tell that that petal is extending over that leaf. So when I come to do the flower, I'll just paint that petal over top of the leaf. I'll extend it over top of the leaf. So no problem there. Now, magnolia leaves are more of a true, they're more of a bluey green, a true green leaning to a blue green. So I'm doing my base layer here in a very true green, and then I'm going to add some highlights. Just like before, I will come in and add a couple more layers of paint wherever I want to add some detail or some lowlights or some highlights. Again, remember, gouache, we can go in any order we want, back and forth. So it's I have the freedom to make adjustments on the fly. You'll also notice, again, I'm using my brush and the strokes that it makes to create my shapes here. I'm not taking a little tiny paintbrush and outlining the leaf and then filling it in, you know, like a coloring book. I'm using the full body of that brush and pulling it along the paper to cover as much area as possible at one time. This is going to give me nice fluid paint strokes. Now, if you prefer, you could do an outline and then color in the middle. That's whatever you're comfortable with. I just really like these long fluid strokes. It's also great for magnolia leaves because they're a very stiff leaf, and they don't have a lot of dips and valleys in them to reflect all those different areas of light. So a nice long smooth stroke actually lends itself very well to a magnolia leaf. Now, the magnolia leaves also, the back side of them are brown, or kind of yellow ochre, some of them. There's a teddy bear, I think it's called a teddy bear magnolia, that is absolutely beautiful, because some of the back sides can be kind of like just as like a ugly brown. But the teddy bear one, it's almost like velvety, and it's like a really beautiful golden brown. It's so pretty. We have a lot of magnolias here in the South. It's a native tree here in the South, so I've seen a lot of magnolias. They're beautiful. They're so stately, but they're large. Most of them. The teddy bear one, I believe, is a dwarf one. I've looked at them, but I don't have anywhere in my yard to put one. I really wish I did, because I do really, really love the look of the magnolia tree as it's, I mean, the flower is pretty. I'm not like a huge, like, I love magnolia flowers. I think the tree itself as a whole is far and away more beautiful than the flower on its own. I don't know. If you're in the South and you've seen big, beautiful magnolia trees, you know what I'm saying. They have a presence. They're beautiful. Back to the painting. Sorry for my foray there off into admiring nature. So here we go. I'm going to go ahead and fill in the branches. These, I'm going to do them as brown. And just like I did before, I'll come in and add some variations of brown. So I'll add a little white to it and put a couple strokes in there, maybe add a little red to it, and then put some strokes in. Again, it's just all about varying those colors so that you don't have one flat color overall. And that's going to extend to our flowers here as well. So I'm doing the white magnolias, but you'll notice that they kind of look creamy, especially when I lay down this lighter cream up against the ones that I've already painted. So I took mostly white, I added a tiny bit of yellow ochre to it, and I painted the base of my petals. And then the petal that was in the very front, I added more white to that mixture so that it would appear as if it was in front. Now I'm going to continue brightening up any petals that need to be in the front, or deepening any petals that I need to push to the back. Again, I can go back and forth here, back and forth. So if I need to repaint in that front petal with more white, I can do that, and it will completely cover the petals behind it. You'll notice that I went with yellow ochre. So I went with warm colors for my shadow. I rarely use gray to add shadows to my white flowers, and that's just a personal preference. I would much rather use a something purpley or yellowy or even green tinted to add shadows to white flowers, because again, I want these to look like as if they're being hit by the sunlight, which is going to give them a warm glow. And also we have a lot of brown and that green around it, and that's going to be bounced onto the flower by the sunshine and the light hitting it. So the yellow ochre just made a lot of sense to me personally to use as my shadow color or my bounced light color. The centers of these flowers are going to be primarily mixtures of yellow ochre as well. So as we get closer to the center of the flower, when the light hits it, the color is going to be bounced onto the petals from that center. So again, to me, the yellow ochre was the way to go. And it still reads as a white flower. You saw in the picture before we started painting that it still reads as a white flower, even though I didn't use stark white. I also wanted to reserve the stark white for my brightest highlights, right? So if I made this entire flower bright white and then put some gray in there, especially with gouache, again, because it doesn't have that same luminosity as watercolor, just using gray would have made it appear extremely flat. So again, that the warm shadows here give it more life. And I'll go back and forth here, deepening up areas that I think need deepened and brightening areas that I think need brightened. And this, again, can't stress it enough. Broken record. It's the beauty of gouache. I can go back and forth as many times as I need to until I get it to look just the way I want it to. So again, super forgiving. And unlike watercolor that usually looks horrible until it doesn't, gouache kind of what you put down is what you're going to get pretty much when it dries. So there really isn't that ugly stage that we have with watercolor. Now, I am not knocking watercolor by any means. If you've been around here a minute, if you're familiar with my work, you know watercolor is my true love and I will never badmouth it. But I do recognize that there is a learning curve to it, and that you have to push through the ugly sometimes. With gouache, it's like I said, it's pretty much what you see is what you get. You lay it down, you know that that's what it's going to look like when it dries. All right, so I've moved on to the large center flower here, and this is going to be done in the same way that I did the other ones. I'm going to paint in the darker back petals first, then I can come in and layer the brighter petals on top of that. And then I will add just a little bit of depth and detail with that yellow ochre to the very center. Okay, so I've pretty much finished up all of the base layers and a few of the details here on this. I did go ahead and add in the base layers for the center, and now I'm just finishing up with adding in these little buds. So again, just like before, I'm going to do a mixture of the yellow ochre and the white, and then I will come in and add some details, a little bit of shadow, and then the brighter white. Now, I still have not added in a pure white. I am going to reserve the pure white for the brightest parts of our magnolias here. Like you can see right here, I'm adding in some pure white to show the petals that are in the front, and then also any areas where the petals are flipped and catching the light. If I had went in too light too soon, white can only be so bright, right? If I had done all of these in pure white, there's really nowhere for me to go in terms of highlight. So when you're working with white flowers, you have to make sure that you have several levels of white, several different variations of that white. If you've ever tried to pick out a white paint, you know that there are so many different shades of white and they can be so minute, but when you put them all together side by side, you can most definitely see all of the variations in those shades of white. So here I am achieving the look of an overall white flower, but because I am varying so much with the different shades of the yellow ochre mixed in with that white, I'm able to achieve several levels of white. So here we're getting super close to being done with this. There's just a few areas where I feel like we could use a little more pop. And so I've added a few little lighter areas into the centers of these flowers. These are going to be our highlights. This center of this large one gave me so many issues, you guys. Gave me so much trouble. I finally ended up with something that I was happy with. I think I could still, if I did this a second time or even a third time, I think I could improve on the center. I was very happy with the leaves. I think the leaves turned out absolutely gorgeous. And then the topmost flower, in the end, actually both of the side view flowers, I absolutely love how they turned out. I think that they turned out so good. Now this forward facing flower, when I do this image again, now I say when because I will do this again, I'm a huge proponent of doing one image or one subject several times. Every time you paint it, you will learn something different. You'll have a different approach. So I think that it's very important to practice your subjects multiple times because you won't know, again, what you like and what you don't like, what works and what doesn't work, unless you actually just attempt it. So if I were to do anything again, I would concentrate more on achieving the look that I wanted for this front-facing flower. I think in the end, I did manage to pull it off. But there was a lot of back and forth, and thankfully, because I'm using the gouache, I could do that back and forth, and I could continue to work it until it was something that I was happy with. Now, a few well-placed shots of deeper color are going to help me to separate some of these petals, and then I can come in and add a few more detail lines to things like these buds here. Just a couple of very thin striations of darker color, and I'm using the 3/10 brush here, I believe it is. I think that's what I'm using. Couple on the petals here. Again, I don't know when to quit, you guys. So don't ask me for advice on that. There's a saying, know when to stop. Yeah, I haven't mastered that yet. When you master that, let me know the secret, and I'd be happy to learn that one, because I still have problems with knowing when to stop. But overall, I am really happy with how all of these turned out, and I had a lot of fun painting them. I did go ahead and paint a more detailed version of the beauty found in a vase as well. So let's go ahead and take a look at all three of the paintings finished side by side. So here they are all together. You can see they have three very different looks. I love the fact that we started with stamps to create these, but we were able to achieve something very unique each time we did it. And I chose the favorite of my two from this one, which is the more expressive florals. That's just my personal taste. And all I had to do is add a sentiment and mount it to a card base. The sentiments here are from the Autumn Bountiful Beauty stamp set. I just heat embossed it and then die cut it. And that one is pretty much done. Simple, beautiful. And then for the Graceful Magnolias, I just thought this one had such a serene quality that I went with the sentiment included in the set. It's just a simple script with sympathy, and I think it complements the image beautifully. I really hope that you guys enjoyed today's video and this closer look at gouache paired with your stamped images. If you did, don't forget to give this a thumbs up, and if you're not already, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss any future videos. You'll find all of the featured products used in the description box below. And as always, I want to thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye.